Hey guys, it's Abdul for the good folks over at Leon Tailoring, 809 North Delaware, downtown Indianapolis. No, just because it's tailor-made clothing does not mean it is out of your price range. You walk into Leon Tailoring, you'll see a great wide selection of clothes that are actually quite reasonable and quite affordable and very comparable to what you pay at the big box stores. It's just the fact that it's just better clothes that last longer. So don't let the tailoring part fool you. Swing on by Leon Tailoring and see what I'm talking about. Leon Tailoring, 809 North Delaware and downtown Indianapolis. That's Leon Tailoring, 809 North Delaware and downtown Indianapolis. Well, the state Democrat-Republican conventions are all nice and done. You got national conventions underway. Republicans wrapping up this week as we record this program on Thursday. Democrats in a couple of weeks. So to join us to put all this in perspective, two of our good friends, Pete Seat of Bose Public Affairs and Brad Klopfenstein of Brad Klopfenstein Incorporated.
I run the Greater Lawrence Chamber of Commerce, Abdul, and don't you forget it.
So, Pete, let's start with you. How would you describe our current national, state, local climate these days? And remember, this is a family show.
I was going to say, do you have the bleeper ready?
I can't bleep it out later on. I have done that before.
Oh, my gosh. Well, let's just, you want to put this in perspective, okay? Look at the last 3 weeks of our lives, starting back with the debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden at the end of June, and then all the calls for Biden to get out of the race, to withdraw, some people even suggesting he should resign the presidency altogether. And then as we think things are solidifying after about 2 weeks, you have the absolutely unexpected, tragic, horrific assassination attempt on former President Trump in Pennsylvania. And that followed 48 hours later with the Republican National Convention kicking off in Milwaukee. And as we sit here, guess what's happening again? Democrats are starting to ask Joe Biden to get out of the race. And there's even reports, we'll see what happens, that it could happen as early as this weekend. So the state of affairs of our national politics is who the heck knows? Because it is changing minute by minute, day by day. And I will just share real quick. Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, I was live on CNN, introduced.
Name dropper.
Yeah, you do it too. No, I was live, and we were introduced. We were going to do some rally previewing. Trump came out. He started speaking. They cut us off, and we were kind of in a holding pattern waiting for the rally to end so we could come back on and talk about it when the tragedy unfolded. In those moments, not only was I kind of shaken by the whole thing, I felt like I was there, but you really thought, wow, this election that's it. This could be over. How do you beat this? Like, how do you defeat him now? It sounded like Democrats were resigned to their plight of having Joe Biden as their nominee. And 96 hours later, Adam Schiff is coming out publicly and saying Biden should get out of the race. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries,
yeah.
Are all, behind the scenes pushing Biden to get out of the race. It's anybody's guess what we'll be talking about next week.
Abdul,
Brad?
Let me start by saying this is the least important election of our lifetime because we have less time to deal with the results of this than any previous election. It is, for junkies like us, this is interesting. Although I've actually found myself having to turn off the news just to check out, just because there's so much out there and so much available. As Pete mentioned, the events of Saturday were amazing. And one more inch to the right, and we'd be having a very different conversation today. And it would, conceivably, we could have had two different candidates at the top of the ticket for both the Republicans and Democrats by the time we get to November. Had the shooter hit the mark. That gives me chills just to think about that. But national politics is certainly right now, and some of it's because we had the Republican convention this week. The Democrat convention is coming up shortly. National politics seems to be taking the headlines right now. But there's a whole lot of interesting stuff going on here in Indiana. And, I just kind of wring my hands like, oh, man, this is great to watch.
Our guests on the program today are Pete Seat, Brad Klopfenstein, sort of getting the lay of the land of the state and national and local politics here in the state of Indiana. The one thing, gentlemen, that sort of surprised me in the whole assassination attempt was the Secret Service. Because usually you'd think that Secret Service had the area secured, but apparently there was that one spot in the tree where there was a line of sight with stage. And my thing is like, why didn't anybody check that part out? Now, granted, obviously hindsight is 2020. You can't anticipate everything because, unfortunately, if somebody wants to harm an individual, the president, they'll figure out a way to do that. But that just seemed almost like Secret Service protection, almost like 101. Pete, you worked in the White House before. Doing things with former President George W. Bush. George W. George W. Not son, not father. I would assume that when you do that advance, the Secret Service are checking these out like days beforehand.
I never felt safer or more protected than when the Secret Service were in the room. And they are incredible men and women who literally put their lives on the line each and every day, not just to protect presidents and the families of the president and vice president, but also candidates for president and former presidents. And when you're traveling with the president, they're also charged with making sure that the traveling party is safe and secure. I think there are obviously a lot of questions. We don't have the answers. The sleuths of the internet wearing their little detective fedoras.
I mean, the same people who have their law degrees from Facebook University.
And constitutional scholars and medical experts. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how they have the time in the day to know as much as they know, but they seem to have figured everything out, of course. And turns out they're, probably 99% wrong. But we need to wait for an independent investigation to truly understand exactly what unfolded, why this individual was able to gain access to the roof, 150 yards, I believe, from former President Trump. And it's incredibly concerning. I mean, especially in this world that we live in today, where folks just don't know how to handle their emotions anymore and are lashing out, not necessarily with physical violence or gun violence, but just in our words and how we treat each other. It's sad to watch, concerning to watch, and I'm waiting for the results of that investigation before drawing any conclusion.
Brad, one of the things I kind of mentioned was obviously individuals are responsible for their own actions, but my thing was hopefully if some good came out of this, and I use the term good with air quotes, that maybe this will kind of people like, hey, maybe just need to tone down some of this vitriol.
I hope, and there seems to be a very conciliatory attitude coming from all sides at the moment, and I hope that manages to stay through the election. Because I have seen Republicans and Democrats talking together saying, yeah, we were probably getting a little wonky there, and we could probably tone this down and still be fine. I hope that continues. And then kind of to dovetail on what Pete was saying, I'm looking forward to seeing, finding more information out about the shooter. It sounds like, at least right now, there's not a lot in his background that would indicate that he would have been, somebody who was going to do something like this.
But he fit the profile.
He did fit the profile, but I could totally see this becoming kind of like the Las Vegas shooter, where people eventually just shrug their shoulders and say, well, yeah, we don't know. And I think that would be a shame. Though they're certainly going to find that there were some shortcomings. It'll be interesting to find out if anybody was told to stand down, if somebody had him. I mean, I've heard rumors that one of the sharpshooters had him in his sights for a couple minutes ahead of time, and they wouldn't let him do anything about it. So we'll see what comes of it. But at least for now, it seems like the flaming has toned down some. And I mean, I really hope that stays the course, because that's what I would like to see.
Can I just add one thing that's been interesting to me, and I don't know that anyone else has pointed it out, is the one person who you think would throw the biggest, hottest flames, the person who was targeted that day, hasn't said a word.
No.
He hasn't attacked the Secret Service. He hasn't questioned anything. Now, he's obviously in a very different position than any of us are in, because he was the target of that attempt, but it has been very interesting to me that everything he has said to date has been very complimentary of the Secret Service and their actions that day. It could change down the line, but I think it's worth pointing out.
Do you think we'll see a kinder, gentler Donald Trump moving forward? mean, he had a brush
I
with
don't
death.
make predictions in politics anymore.
Our guests on the program today are Pete Seat, Brad Klopfenstein, sort of getting a lay of the political landscape here in the nation as well as Indiana. But Pete, it's interesting. Like I say, we're talking about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump's life, and it reminded me of John Hinckley Jr. and his attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan. Because back then we didn't have the social media, we didn't have everybody's a detective sleuth, but they played it over and over and over and over again. That became sort of engraved in our minds. And it also reminded me of the old when Buckwheat got shot on Saturday Night Live. It was a guy named John David Stutz who shot Buckwheat. Like, did you believe he shot Buckwheat? Oh, yeah, they sure did. That's all they ever talked about. It's like, wow. just your thoughts on the media coverage of all this.
Well, I think most of the media actually handled it very responsibly in those first minutes. I know there was a lot of criticism, of course, online. Who goes online to say nice things about each other? People were criticizing some of the headlines, Trump escorted off stage after loud noises. Okay, well, technically that's true. And let's say it was not an assassination attempt and they put that in the headline. How do you think people would have responded to that, to them trying to sensationalize it and make it a bigger story than it actually was? And so I think they all handled it relatively responsibly. As I mentioned, since I was on CNN right then, I was watching CNN, and they actually took a while until they replayed the clip because they wanted to check it out to make sure that they weren't going to trigger their audience with something grotesque. And I think that is precisely the way that it should be handled. I do want to add, though, real quick, there's been a lot of conversation in the aftermath of this, that we need to tone down the rhetoric of our politics, that we need, we cannot stand for political violence. And that's all accurate. But why aren't we talking about just the rhetoric of life and the violence of life? Like, if we only focus on politics, we will swing and miss on this. And I kind of touched on that earlier. I mean, how many times do we see stories about motorists who get peeved off that someone honks at them and they track them down at a gas station and kill them? How many times do we see stories of someone, going off on a flight attendant and grounding a plane? That has nothing to do with politics. And I think the politicians who are talking about it that way are cut off from reality. They live in a bubble and they think it's always just about politics. There's something much broader here.
Brad, I agree with Pete. I mean, there's a humanity aspect to this that I think a lot of people lose sight of. And frankly, Twitter is like the worst on, just being human and being kind to each other. Jim Merritt and I have a podcast called Merritt in the Morning. And I mean, our whole mantra is
name drop.
Yeah, that's absolutely. That was Merritt in the Morning podcast, available on YouTube and Facebook. But our mantra is work hard and be nice. And I think that's a great mantra. And there's not nearly enough of that in politics and the political universe. And I think it's because too many people talk at people and not to people.
And you're listening to the weekend edition of Abdul-Hakim here on 93 WIBC. And also, this will be played online on Indy Politics and also my weekend public affairs program, Indiana Issues. It's interesting, Brad, that you brought that up because whatever happened to the old days where people could disagree without being disagreeable, number one, and then number two, and Pete, I want to get your thoughts on this too. I think sometimes we tend to maybe sort of romanticize the past a little bit, say, no, these great men of oratory, they all were like, no, the founding fathers actually kind of hated each other.
Yeah, they did.
You mentioned Twitter back in the 1776. That Jefferson's really a half. he's a half-breed squad mulatto. Like, wow, okay, guys, let's calm that down a little bit.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mentioned Jim Merritt. And when Jim Merritt was a state senator, occasionally he would get a letter or an email in his office from a constituent who basically would flame on him. Well, Jim would show up on her door and say, "Hi, I'm Jim Merritt. I'm your state senator. I understand you have a concern. I'd like to talk about it." He's like, "Yeah, it's amazing how much their tone changed when you're standing on their doorstep."
Imagine that. Because it's kind of hard to hate somebody face to face.
It is. It is. But I think that there should be more face to face interactions. I mean, it's It used to be your entertainment was doing something with your neighbors because there were no electronics. So you got to know your neighbors and you all kind of worked together, and you might not necessarily like each other, but you learned how to get along. Well, now if you're hiding in your basement and all you're doing is flaming on a keyboard, I mean, you don't care. You're never going to see these people, and you can say whatever you want. And I think politeness and civility, we need a remedial class on that.
So do we need, Pete, Remedial 101, or at least Political Discussion 098, the course you take when you weren't quite ready for Algebra 1 in college?
Well, I wish our insults were as eloquent as they were back in the days of the Founding Fathers, because those are some doozies to read. Actually, there are words I've never heard of in some of those insults. But maybe this is a simplistic way of looking at it. I keep coming back to one of the culprits, what I believe to be one of the culprits of this whole ecosystem that we've created of vitriol in life, is just the on-demand nature of consumerism. And we've all been conditioned to get exactly what we want at the precise moment that we want it. So, whatever these Starbucks orders are that people have with like 18 different, customizations, or, I want my pizza well done, light cheese, extra pepperoni, like all this stuff. And then DoorDash brings it there. It's there in 6 minutes. When you don't get what you want, you get angry and you get upset and you lash out. And there's a difference. Like, you can't build consensus that way. You can't come to agreement. You can't even acknowledge that someone may have a different point of view than you. And so then people go into their little echo chambers, and they don't want to commiserate and interact with people who think differently than them, because it's going to make me go insane. Which is why I'm sitting like 12 feet from Brad right now, because if he gets any closer, I might go crazy.
I thought you were social distancing. I'm sorry, that was COVID. That was a couple of years ago. Our guests on the program today are our good friends Pete Seed, Brad Klopfenstein, as we sort of check out the lay of the political landscape here in the nation, as well as the state of Indiana. Okay, gentlemen, let's change gears. We just wrapped up this past weekend the Democrat state convention. A couple weeks before that, we had the Republican state convention. A couple weeks before that, we had the Libertarian state convention. And I take great pride in the fact I'm the only reporter in Indiana who goes to all three each time. Yay, me.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of candidates that might have gone to all three.
Yeah.
At least two.
Yeah, don't get me started on that one. We'll get to that in just a bit. Pete, let me get your thoughts on Indiana's political process with all three state conventions. Anything surprise you, not surprise you?
With the Democrat convention,
or Democrat
that they found 2,000 Democrats in Indiana, that was kind of shocking to me. Obviously in jest, but
2198, I think. Was
wow. The results were not surprising. Obviously I'm not as in touch and in tune with Democrat state politics, but I didn't sense from the outside that the Attorney General's race was nearly as competitive as some were portraying it to be. I thought in the end Terry Gooden would ultimately be the lieutenant governor nominee. So it kind of played out. Obviously people like a little bit of drama and speculation and
you mean people like me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I wasn't looking at you when I said it, but it kind of played out precisely as expected.
Brad, Democrat Republican state conventions?
So, they were interesting. Even the Libertarian convention was interesting. I think the one thing that gets lost in all this, especially like in the Micah Beckwith, Mike Braun situation, where Braun did not get his pick for lieutenant governor, this is not the first time it happened. If you recall 4 years ago when Donald Rainwater ran, he came in endorsing a different person at the Libertarian state convention, and he ended up with his opponent's lieutenant governor pick, which... that could have been very awkward. In their case, they worked together very well. I think it'll be interesting to watch and see if Beckwith and Braun can set their differences aside until at least after the election, or if that starts to boil up beforehand. I know the Democrats will probably play it up. I'm also curious to see Donald Rainwater got, close to 11% 4 years ago. It'll be really interesting to see if his support can grow from there, or if that was kind of a unique time and place. I like Donald Rainwater a lot, and I think he has a lot of good things to say. I'm glad that he raised enough money that he got into the Fox 59 debate. I certainly think that I have some questions about Fox 59 and their threshold and to get into the debate, but I mean, it'll be interesting to watch just because you have three very different candidates who all have different things to say. And then Jennifer McCormick, will she actually represent Democrats, or will she just be a Republican with an axe to grind?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the races here in Indiana, people want to get your thoughts on this. You have Jennifer McCormick, a Republican, or a Democrat who used to be a Republican. You have Mike Braun, who's a Republican who used to be a Democrat. He voted in the Democratic primary down in Jasper back in 2008, which means, as far as I'm concerned, if you vote in the primary, you're with that party at least at the time. And then if you look at the lieutenant governor candidates, you had Jennifer McCormick pick Terry Gooden, who ticks off the progressives in his party, and you've got Micah Beckwith, who makes the moderates and independent Republicans kind of scary. Welcome to 2024 and all of its splendor and glory.
And people say there's no unity in politics. Come on now. You just explained it perfectly. I'll just go back to the state Republican convention. I was safely in New York, which I don't know that a lot of people say they're safely in New York City, but I was not here at the time. My take on the results, there has been, and this has been demonstrated convention after convention, that delegates have an affinity for familiarity, for people who they know, they've gotten to know, people who show up to their chili cook-off and their chicken fundraisers all across this state. And they might not necessarily agree with that individual politically or ideologically, but they like knowing them. And whether that's, bragging to their friends that they know a statewide elected official, or just the comfort that they know someone in a high office, that means a lot. And, I know you go back to the 2022 state convention, which I know a little bit about as I was a candidate there. But a lot of people focus on, Diego Morales. It was a repudiation of the governor and the establishment. Yeah, there was some of that for sure. But there's also the fact that he's gone to every Lincoln Day dinner for a decade. Over and over and over and over and over again. And people knew him. And whether they actually knew a lot about him, they just felt like they did. And that matters. And so, Micah Beckwith did have that kind of that head start. And Julie McGuire had a very short runway to become familiar in really just a couple of days.
Do you think it was interesting that I never actually heard her speak prior to the convention? I thought that was a very poor rollout of your chosen candidate when you knew that there was already somebody that had some steam in Micah.
You mean Julie McGuire?
Julie McGuire, I'm sorry. So, yeah, I think they did a very poor rollout of Julie McGuire leading up to the Republican convention, because I never heard her talk. I never heard a statement from her. And I think that they just assumed that there were going to be enough Braun delegates there to push her across the finish line. And I think that they probably could have had her come out and be a little bit more forceful and do better.
Brad Klopfenstein, Pete Seat on the program today. Pete, Brad brought up an interesting point because what I'd heard why Julie McGuire didn't get the nod was because, number one, the Braun people, and they're all friends of ours and known them for years, basically made an assumption that, hey, I'm the nominee, I'll automatically get who I want. And they're also almost sort of being too cute by half. I heard them sort of bullying delegates, like, hey, if you don't give us blah, blah, blah. And delegates, I found, don't like to be told what to do. Because actually the quickest way to get them to do the opposite is to tell them what to do. Call me crazy.
Delegates make decisions for a variety of reasons. Rarely are they rational reasons. And there are delegates who will decide to support a candidate on a first ballot because they had better booze at their hospitality suite. There are delegates who will decide on a candidate based on their speech, as you mentioned, at a convention. I didn't watch either of the speeches, so I can't speak to those, but I can tell you, going back to 2022, I walked off the stage after giving my speech, and a gentleman grabbed my arm. I did not know who he was. And he was a delegate, of course, and he stopped me and he said, "You were fourth on my list of 4 candidates. You're now the guy I'm voting for." And that was it. It was just that 8 minutes. And whatever it was, it appealed to him. He was impressed by it. And maybe it depressed other people. I don't know. But all those moments, like every single one, you hate to say that they're make or break, but they could be for someone somewhere among that delegate pool, and you got to put thought into everything you do.
So it's interesting. You mentioned Diego Morales, and he'd been to every Lincoln Day dinner. I mean, I know even since he's been elected, he spends an enormous amount of time up in northern Indiana just going to county party meetings. He's at every dinner still. He's in every parade he can possibly get in. And while you don't see a lot of them in central Indiana, I know that they see him a lot in northern Indiana. I'm assuming they see him a lot in southern Indiana. And there is something to be said for that. And it's just, you make that personal connection. And there are some people in those rooms who say, oh, I've met Pete Seat. I find him to be a nice guy. He shook my hand. I'm going to vote for him.
When I was speaking at the Morgan County Lincoln Day, this was a couple years ago, during the 2022, the Holly Sullivan Diego Morales race, and it's dinner time, and where's Diego? At the table with the plate and the gloves and handing people their plates and serving things, and Holly Sullivan's just sitting there at the table. I was like, Holly, how do you, if you're going to win this thing, I recommend getting about your seat and just go and interacting with people. But once again, that interaction, that human, I always tell people, politics is fundamentally an emotional process. People vote for who they like and vote against who they can't stand.
Yep.
Why did my wife vote for Barack Obama, Mitch Daniels, Greg Ballard, and Cherish Pryor? Because she likes them, period. I can't figure out her politics most days. I can't figure out nothing about my wife most days. But she voted for who she likes, and that's how most people. Now, why you like them, maybe their positions on issues or whatever, their personality, but fundamentally, voting is an emotional process.
Yeah. It's funny, if there was ever a recount and they looked at my ballot, they'd probably throw it out. They're like, this guy has no idea what he's doing. He voted for a couple Democrats, a couple Libertarians, a couple Republicans over here. There's no way somebody would cast a ballot like that. But yeah, I vote for people that I know, and I vote for people that I trust, and I tend to vote against people who I know are jerks.
Our guest on the program today, Pete Seat, Brad Klopfenstein, talk about the lay of the politics in Indiana. Okay, gentlemen, let's talk about what we're really here today. Let's talk about John Schmidt, the Republican candidate for Congress, who showed up at the Democratic State Convention, and he was there. Well, we'll get to who he's there with in a second, but when I saw him there, I was like, okay, that looks like John Schmidt. But I figured, okay, maybe there's something else going on. The convention is a pretty big place. It's easy to get turned around, walking the wrong way, or just you got some time to sort of walk through, see what else is going on. Like, okay, maybe he's just kind of walking through, just checking out what's going on here. So I walked over, hey, John, what's going on? Like, hey, what are you doing here? I'm here helping out a friend campaign. Like, what? You're a Republican, right? And this is a Democratic convention. So who are you campaigning for? He said, Bob Kern. And all I could do was just like, my jaw just dropped to the floor. And for a rare moment in time, I was actually speechless. And it took that to make me speak. Like, but he's what?
Well, that might be the single largest indicator of the state of the Republican Party in Marion County. That when they had a ballot vacancy because the woman that won the primary passed away before the primary, but after the deadline to withdraw. So she ended up winning that primary against three other people. And then they had to have a caucus, and they caucused in John Schmidt. So apparently, at least the people who showed up to the caucus thought either John was the best one or they just wanted to have a big joke, make a joke out of it. I'm not sure. But it's funny. Pete and I were talking in the elevator about John Schmidt. John Schmidt's crazy. And, I mean, almost verifiably crazy, which is interesting. I signed for his petition one time when he wanted to run for mayor or something. But I mean, he's a conspiratorialist, and he is not a serious candidate. And him showing up to the Democrat convention reaffirms everything I just said.
Pete, your thoughts?
At some level, I can appreciate friendship and loyalty. End statement. That's all I have to say. I mean, it does. And look, it's not the only time, and it's not the only time you've seen that happen. Now, obviously, the dynamic. I mean, the fact that you're a nominee for one party for Congress going to the state convention of another party. There's a lot going on there. It's not that unheard of for someone who is close to a person who's running, on another party's ticket to help them out. We see it happen constantly. But it is it certainly caught the attention of a lot of people. And honestly, I'm glad it happened because you were speechless for a few minutes and the world rejoiced.
Yes, they did. And what sort of surprised me the most was like, okay, it's one thing that if you're like at a town hall kind of open forum, say like a hobnob or something, where, hey, I'm a Republican, but I want to campaign for my friend who's a Democrat because there's a chance you could convince a voter, hey, look, I've got bipartisan support, I'm a man of the people, blah, blah, blah. But this is a state convention. I mean, by the very nature, 90% of the people who are here chose to be here. They ran for convention delegate or state convention delegate or got appointed convention delegate, which means they are hardcore Democrats or Republicans. So number one, what makes you think you're going to change anybody's mind? And number two, you're running against the guy who at the Hoosier Hospitality Dinner got the biggest round of applause out of anybody in the entire room. That I just couldn't quite figure out to save my life.
Now, I've got a question for Pete. Why was Republican insiders working so hard to unseat delegates who had already qualified for the ballot and then won a delegate slot at the state convention? And then they were trying to remove them, saying that they were not true Republicans because they hadn't met all the thresholds, even though they clearly had voted in the last two primary elections in the Republican primary. So why were Republicans trying to do that?
Well, I don't know about specific instances that you're referencing. I will say, just generally speaking, Republicans like to follow rules, unlike the Democratic Party that could very well completely throw out the will of Democratic primary voters and replace their presidential nominee in days or hours away. But, that two primary rule was instituted because I will say, and I know there are people who disagree with me here, I think we should just have party registration and it would probably solve a lot of problems.
Yep.
Here, you're just a registered voter. You're not a registered Republican or a registered Democrat. And that two primary rule was put in place because predominantly in southern Indiana, there were former Democrat elected officials who would vote in one Republican primary and then run as a Republican, get elected, and then govern as a Democrat. And it was causing problems. So that rule was instituted. There also have been issues with some Republicans who were very vocal in their support for your candidate for governor in the last round in 2020, Donald Rainwater. They were not shy about that. And that makes you a Republican not in good standing to openly support the nominee of another party against a Republican. That makes you a Republican not in good standing. And so I think that's probably what you're referencing was some of those issues.
I know it was happening actively in Vanderburgh County, and this was post-primary, pre-convention, where they were going through and culling through the people who'd won delegate slots.
Well, that's Vandenberg County. That's a whole different ball of wax.
I mean, they are on God's time zone. Let's be clear, in the Central Time. But yeah, I mean, there's a
single class basketball now too.
There are a lot of things going down there. There's there is an orchestrated effort to vote out the county Republican chairman. So. Drama times drama.
Final segment, Jim. We got a couple minutes left here. Just want to get your thoughts. Like I said, this just happened literally yesterday, and probably will play out for the next few days. Search warrant served on Gabriel Whitley, who was a candidate for Congress in the 7th Congressional District. Goes to campaign finance reports. The FBI is looking at all this. This obviously can't be good, at least for Mr. Whitley. Brad?
No, it's not good. I would like to just say who, although I was
George Santos.
Yes. So unfortunately, I feel bad for Gabe Whitley just because he's not altogether there, and I mean there is some sort of mental deficiency there, and he wants to present himself as being a player, which is why he allegedly invented donors that didn't exist, which the way Indiana campaign finance forms work, you can show a donation and an expenditure to and from the same group or individual, and you don't have to have a bank record to show that money actually came in and went back out. So, I mean, you can claim you raised $500,000, and it's really hard to prove that you did or did not. So he is alleging that he raised all this money and then gave that money right back. But he's like, oh, yeah, I raised $300,000. And he also alleged that he was endorsed by a veterans group that did not exist. And, yeah, you start looking at this in the aggregate, and you're like, all right, this guy needs to go away. But since he doesn't go away, now the FBI is searching through his house. And I think that hopefully he will get the message that he needs to knock this off, because back to Vanderburgh County, he did this in Vanderburgh County a few years ago too.
Pete.
Well, the statement I saw he put on, I believe, social media, he said that this was part of an investigation into local corruption. And that turns out to be quite truthful. Yeah, I mean, he's obviously trying to, play it off as it's someone else who's doing the corruption. But I'm not sure they would be confiscating all your devices if you weren't part of the investigation.
Yeah, his statement is, that's me. I was the one who was corrupt.
I'll tell you, gentlemen, some days the show just writes itself.
Yes, it does.
It really does. Our guests on the program today have been our good buddy Brad Klopfenstein and also a good friend, Pete C. Gentlemen, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you very much for being with us, and we'll probably be chatting again sometime around September, October.
Looking forward to it, Abdul.
Thank you.